about 50 years ago or 60 years ago, humans used to think that running 100 meters in under 3 minutes was impossible. Or in under a minute was impossible. And then somebody did it, and every week that new record happened, no? And they always say, like, is it because people grew bionic legs? No, it's just that barrier in their mind disappeared. And I think that's a lot of what is still happening here in Latin America for us to believe that Latin American dream can happen.
Our featured speaker today is the CEO at Erudite and a GP at Billion Neurons, a venture capital fund that invests in supply chain, SaaS, and fintech startups in pre-seed and seed in Latam. As an entrepreneur, engineer, and woman in tech, Lorena is passionate about building and funding great products and teams. Lorena, it's a great pleasure to have you as our featured guest today. Thanks so much for being willing to share this part of your journey with us.
No, thank you for having me.
I was hoping you could talk about your experience building Rappi. It's thrilling to read on paper that you were the global head of Rappi's Paga con Rappi.
Paga con Rappi is like pay with Rappi.
Pay with
which is kind of an Apple Pay.
Oh, okay. But I imagine growing to 1 million transactions in 3 months was no easy feat.
It wasn't. It wasn't, especially because it was a combination of a set of products that had to happen in order for Rappi to be more successful. No, like as many of you know, Rappi is kind of the Uber Eats or the DoorDash or the delivery hero for Latin America. And Rappi, basically what it started doing was delivering food to your doorsteps. And it reached 100 million users, and it was one of the very first unicorns here in the region. And part of what is very interesting about Rappi as well is that it was one of the companies that fundraised capital from some of the best-known funds worldwide. No, so it has funding from Sequoia, from Andreessen, it went Y Combinator, it has money from SoftBank. And so Rappi was a company that, even though it was built in Latin America, it was built using a lot of the principles from Silicon Valley and from the top companies, but very much adapted to the Latin American culture. And one of the best things about Rappi was basically believing there's a Latin American dream. Well, for a lot of Americans here, an American dream sounds like something that you were born with. In Latin America, that is not necessarily the case. There are so many hardships with poverty, with like all of the division, the access to education, access to so many things. And if you're privileged like me, that get to live like the 10% of the country, then yes, you do have opportunities to go and study abroad. Yes, you have the opportunity to speak English. Yes, you have the opportunity to consume information. But if you weren't as lucky, and that's part of what I tell you about it being a matter of, yes, of effort, but that there's also a lot of luck in that piece, no? Because I see, for example, a lot of my classmates from high school. I didn't go to any of the fancy high schools in my hometown. And some of them are drug dealers. And so that's part of why building a Latin American dream became so important. And I think there's 3 major things about Rappi here in the region. The first major thing is obviously that during COVID, it was one of the main motors to save the economies in all the 9 markets where Rappi operates. Why? Because obviously the restaurant industry was one of the most affected. Most of the restaurants that were not in the platform were not even digitally savvy enough. And so doing all of that digital transformation, and at that beginning, I was working in payments, but we all ended up uploading menus and helping onboard restaurants so that they wouldn't die during the pandemic. Bear in mind that different to other countries in the world, 2 million people don't have other work opportunities. So it's people who was barely making the minimum wage. I think that the minimum wage around here is about $400 a month. And so Rapitenderos are making about $800 and working on their own and at their own pace. So it's also creating entrepreneurship within the segment of the population. The thing is that basically we became like the mafia from PayPal. But we like to be called mafia because mafia is a thing here because of all the drug dealers and the narcos, as you have seen in Netflix. So the Rappi Magia is actually the house of a lot of entrepreneurs in Latin America. Rappi has created more than 90 companies in the region. And so even if it was an investment fund or incubator, it's one of the most successful ones because also the amount of funding, like the traction that most of the ex-Rappi operations have made is impressive.
That is incredibly impressive. I mean, you're talking about double the salary too. So, I can understand why you were so passionate to solve this problem, but what gave you the approach to solve this problem? Like, how did you see that? Did you wind up testing other things early on that didn't really work?
Yeah, in the case of Pack on Rappi, we first started creating something that was more like a payment link because we were thinking that smaller businesses didn't have ways to accept credit cards. Whenever you did like these bazaars in the street, or like these workshops for handcrafts that are very common here in Latin America, that they didn't have any means to accept credit cards, and buying any type of hardware was kind of prohibitive for them. So we first started doing these payment links. And they started working, but like traction was not great. It was a combination between if they accepted credit cards, a lot of these people had to be banked and had to be fiscalized. And so informality in these economies is important. And they didn't want to report to like the equivalent of the IRS, the earnings, because also earnings are so little. And so we decided to pivot from there to first creating these payment links for call centers, for example. So in here, e-commerce is still very much aided by telephone call centers. A lot of the times it's like you want to place an order, for example, in Home Depot or in Office Max or in Office Depot. And it's like you place the order by phone and then you get these links to pay over the phone. Or you buy a plane ticket, and a lot of the times you still buy it over the phone. And so that was kind of the second product that we were making, but still the amount of transactions that happen through there, and most of those transactions happening in a hybrid between something digital and something physical. What does this mean? That a lot of the times you actually receive with these links kind of a QR code. You go and deposit cash in convenience stores. So think that 7-Elevens in here, or however the convenience store in your country is called, and that cash actually happens as a settlement. All of the cash economy is still in here. So we went into a third iteration, and this one is the one that actually worked. And it was for mobile devices to be able to receive payments using Rappi app or in any other apps. And so that facilitated payments, for example, for parking meters, for parking lots. That facilitated payments for plane tickets whenever you bought them over an app. And it had more fit with the core business of Rappi. What you can see from the core business of Rappi is obviously the people who's able to pay for delivery to their houses and at an extra cost of the price of a hamburger. It's typically the wealthiest people in the region. So actually the wealthiest zones of all of the cities where Rappi thrives. So it became this part of the payments. What was the most interesting was actually the combination of three things. We had just launched a credit card. And so with the launch of a credit card, there was something very interesting because if you were able to do the emission of the card, put all the processing of the payments within the card, then you could create a closed loop payments network. And so that would actually be more profitable than like the actual networks that exist, because in here, we not only have like Visa and MasterCard having that part for the credit cards, there's also a participation of the government. And then there's also participation of other players in a thing called like a compensation chamber, that it's not something that all of the payment systems in the world have. By taking all of these other intermediaries from the loop, the payments could actually become much cheaper.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for taking us through all of that. I think it's so interesting hearing about the things you've tried and the successes and everything that you've done with Rappi. I was hoping we could talk a little bit about Erudite. I hope that's pronounced all right.
Sure.
What are your future ambitions for it? And can you expand on a little bit what your company does and what the vision is for it?
We were actually at a very thriving moment for Erudite. What we started doing is we do HR tech So we do AI for human resources. And what we do is that we connect to data lakes in companies like Slack, Outlook, Microsoft Teams. And then we're able to predict organizational pulse without surveys. Basically, it's like a Google Analytics, but for people. What it's interesting about having a Google Analytics for people, well, if you're a leader, certain things that your employees typically don't tell you face to face, even when they have a lot of trust in you, which is, for example, if they like or not that you switch offices, if they like the way in which you're managing them, if you like the way in which your office is set up, if they like that you have returned to the office, maybe post-COVID. That's the part that we're solving. We're also solving for example, teams that are distributed in different cities and countries and regions in the world, and where you're working at different hours, sometimes from home, sometimes from an office. And so that's the second piece that is very important to the core of how and why Erudite was built. So basically, Erudite has been built for a hybrid of 3 different solutions and pains. One, obviously, in the COVID era, when we started working from home, that division between the moment when I'm working and the moment when I stop working basically became blurred. And so one of the ways in which we could tell if the teams were to have burnout is basically by using the team. The second thing is that when you have these types of cultures, it's very hard sometimes to tell how the teams are doing, no? So, for example, imagine that you're in a finance team in a corporation that is very large and that it's a transnational that has operations in the Americas, in Europe, in Southeast Asia, in Asia Pacific, and in Africa. And all of the finance team might work together. And so a lot of the times you might know that who's probably sitting in Mexico or is sitting in Spain or is sitting in London, or how they're feeling with regards to the country they're working with, but also like with regards to the whole of the organization. And so that's the second problem that we solved. And then the third problem that we solved is, centennials and millennials, we have sort of a sense of needing to belong to an organization. And so part of what we measure, it's like that belonging that people feel within the organizations and how much autonomy they feel, so that you can also predict that you don't have this great resignation that started happening a few years back, which is how we were born. And so part of what is very interesting right now is that the European and the American regulations, and now even Latin America, Mexico, for example, is starting to regulate. India, it's about to regulate. Most of the AI has been regulated right now. And so the use for this purpose has been forbidden in most markets. So we're at a crucial point in our company in terms of needing to reinvent the product in a way that it's fully compliant, and also like having to explain the regulators the consequences of what is happening.
Honestly, I appreciate you saying it that way, because I've worked a lot of different jobs throughout my career, like lower level jobs, I would say. And so my immediate thought with something like this is such an appealing thing to me in theory, and it's such an appealing thing at a high level to be able to evoke systems change. But when you feel like a peon at a call center, this feels like they're going to look at my email. They're going to look at everything I'm doing. They're spying on me. And this goes back to like everybody's fear about AI. So, I obviously read that this was built by psychologists and data scientists. But my question is, how do you really bring emotional intelligence to something like this in a way, where you actually are promoting that this is a good part of change in like this is going to bring change that is good for you, not just high level executives to know who they can cut next month, just because I know what it's like to be in that seat,
Yeah, I think there's a combination of like different types of companies, and this is what we have seen. First, you have companies that don't care about employees, that actually just want to cut employees, and that would never invest in a tool like this because it's like, oh, why would I spend on things to like manage and lead people? Like they just don't care about leading or managing. Then you have a second type of companies which are very scared of doing something because they may look with their hair down in picture. And it's really funny because it's like they prefer to look good in the picture and have a survey where everybody says, yes, everything's okay, even though like the ceiling is burning. But it's like, when that realization that there's a parallel reality to what they're getting in surveys, in poll surveys, like it's something that really scares them. And so where we have seen that is the most adoption, it's those companies that are already doing a lot to serve their workforce, a lot to retain their workforce. Those are the companies that are actually investing on this. And that's part of what I was saying, like, hey, yes, like it's as if you said, don't produce weapons. No, it's like regulate the way in which the weapon is used, which is actually the job that you have as a regulator. And it's like, for example, if you make bias decisions with using a tool, well, first certify that the tool doesn't have any biases, and then certify what decisions you're allowed to and what decisions you're not allowed to make with these types of tools. And it's the same as, and that's part of the reason why I make it similar to weapons, no? Because it's like, it's not don't produce weapons. It's like, okay, make the army, policemen, make private people that have planning on using these weapons be able to use them.
I think that's a brilliant analogy. There's so many parallels between, or so many important points to understanding and utilizing tools in the correct way. I really, really appreciate you taking us through that. Now, you mentioned before when we first started talking how you've lived in quite a few different countries and different cultures, both during education and during work and all those sorts of things. I think it's always interesting to hear about how the different cultures people have lived through and experienced change their worldview, but also how they work and how they lead. Have you had that experience?
Yeah, definitely. The first experience that I had when I left Mexico for the first time was to go and study abroad in Germany. And during that study abroad, actually 3 things happened. The first is that I had to learn German because I didn't know any German at all when I arrived. The second thing that happened was I went to college in Germany. I ended up taking one of the hardest classes of my engineering degree in undergrad in German because they didn't offer it in English or in Spanish. And then the third thing was learning a lot about how Germans think, from even how they use the language. You know? Like, for example, there's 3 things that really surprised me about German, for example. German language. They're very precise in the ways they use words. So that allows them to use way fewer words than what we use in Spanish and in most of the Latin languages. So like they have a word to climb up, they have a word to climb down. Whereas in Spanish is like you go up or you go down. And there's, for example, certain things about also how they think. Like, for example, whenever you have a car, you know, you have the bumper that protects your car from hitting someone. So in the case of Spanish, that bumper is called in a way that it's a protection. So it's a defense. Whereas in the case of Germany, that's actually something that's called an offense. So it's something that you're able to push the other guys. And so it also explains you a lot about the way the different cultures think. And I think that every single one of the cultures has its magic. So for example, in Germany, I learned a lot about being more punctual. Which here in Latin America, it's a mixed asset because everybody's like 20 minutes late to whatever you ask them to do. Then obviously from the US, I learned a lot about this American dream that I told you about. And this American dream, I think, has the fact of like 2 or 3 things that maybe a lot of times when you live in these countries don't realize. Like the first one is even the smaller business are able to make about $1 million in revenues. In Latin America, that's something that it's still very unthinkable. There's something about like these legacy Protestant countries where the sense of community, it's important, but the sense of self is even more important than that sense of community. And for example, here in Latin America, it's like we have a huge sense of community. I always say that I came back because of the 3 Fs: friends, family, and football, and food. And so, like, what happens in here is that sense of belonging becomes so important, but a lot of the times it's like you don't want to be ostracized because you're doing things that are different. For failure, for example, like, well, most of those developed markets understand that failing is just part of succeeding. And failing fast is something that it's important. And here we still failure as something that's shameful, something that you should avoid at all costs. And obviously, if you don't try, you never fail. And there's like this third component about that American dream, which is being able to advance no matter where you come from. That in here, it's a little bit hard to prove because you can have like people who doesn't even speak Spanish that only speak native languages, or you might have people who was born in like super poverty, who was raped. For example, here in Mexico, you know that we have a huge problem with gender violence. We're one of the most developed, underdeveloped markets that we're in the top 25 worst countries to live for a woman because about 8 women are killed every day in this country just because we're women. And so even despite of all of that inequality, then being able to inspire people and tell them that entrepreneurship can be a way, and that's something that I really believe. It can be a way to solve very different problems in the region. No? First, solving problems that neither the government nor the private sector have been able to solve in the last 100 years. Second, being able to solve a lot of that disparities in income because it creates wealth. Or like obviously all of the people building those startups. For example, here in Latin America, the first self-made billionaire woman is actually the founder of Nubank. And so that's one of the very first examples that you can see of that financial improvement happening. And she's a middle-class girl. She was born in a little town. I know her because she went to Kellogg as well. And obviously when you see these stories and when you actually start having these role models, it's one of the big things that we don't have here yet. Those role models that make us believe that $1 million businesses are possible, that $1 billion businesses are possible. That's why I find this so important. They always say this story about the people who was running the 100 meters. I don't know if you know this story, but it's like about 50 years ago or 60 years ago, humans used to think that running 100 meters in under 3 minutes was impossible. Or in under a minute was impossible. And then somebody did it, and every week that new record happened, no? And they always say, like, is it because people grew bionic legs? No, it's that barrier in their mind disappeared. And I think that's a lot of what is still happening here in Latin America for us to believe that a Latin American dream can happen.
Hello all, I hope you're enjoying this discussion with Lorena. I wanted to ask you, our listeners, if you could give us a review in your podcasting platform of choice. We don't run ads and don't have sponsors, but we are looking to grow. So if you feel we bring value to your listening experience, please drop us a review when you can. Thanks so much.
That's a great analogy. And I do like that story because it's not just about how we think about things. It's also about, the human capacity for growth, physical, emotional, mental. You said some really interesting things. I appreciate what you said about language teaching you about how different cultures think, and that you've taken some of those things on for yourself to kind of form your worldview. I find that fascinating. I'm not well-versed in languages, but even as I've learned some Spanish, I really think that that's very interesting to kind of see and also see the parts of English that came from German and Spanish and their origins. It really does kind of teach you about some of our philosophy. And then going further with that, what you said about the American dream, and individuality and community. I think I was raised more with that sense of community than a lot of Americans are. And I didn't celebrate individuality as something other than selfishness for a long time. So I really like the way that you articulated it, because you can kind of see the pros to both. And in my mind, figuring out that middle ground where you are, still serving your community. You're not just like, I don't care about you, I'm just going to go my own way. But you also are willing to fall on your face and fail to do so. that's like the happy marriage of entrepreneurship. So I'm excited that that's what you're promoting to people. And so building on that, I know that you are leading, I think, right? Founder Institute Mexico. I was wondering, how do you even become part of that? I know mentoring is really important to you, but how did you become part of it? And then how did you decide to be a leader? Because that is a big undertaking too.
It was really funny. We were in the middle of fundraising in Silicon Valley a few years back, and met Tadeo. Tadeo is the founder of Founder Institute, and he was roommates with Elon Musk. Right when I met him, it was before the change of government here in Mexico. And this new government, basically what they did was that they disappeared the Ministry for Entrepreneurship. And that Ministry of Entrepreneurship was actually what made successful tech entrepreneurship, because it was created like in a very good way in terms of like promoting all of the legs in the ecosystem. No, it promoted having incubators and accelerators. It promoted doing venture capital. It actually promoted a law for venture capital to be permitted in Mexico, because the way in which the law was, it was even forbidden for you to have people in the cap table that was not working for the company, and if it was not debt. And then the third thing that happened was like basically they were also supporting these entrepreneurs and creating like this hunger for entrepreneurship to happen. I was concerned at the very early stage entrepreneurship was going to disappear in Mexico. And he asked me like, hey, we're looking for somebody to lead Mexico. It's something that would interest you. And I was like, well, I'm in the middle of a startup. Like I'm already fundraising. Like it's what you see here in Silicon Valley. And I was like, but I would love for people to learn and not make the same mistakes that I made when I was in Linio, because Linio was part of Rocket Internet and I was part of the founding team of that. And it was like one of the very first tech companies here in Latin America, like not only in Mexico, but on the whole of the region. And so there were a lot of learnings of what not to do from the way in which we had built. And I felt that I had kind of like a moral duty for doing it. And I asked him like, so how long is time involvement? And he was like, well, 3 hours of class was a week for 14 weeks. And then as many hours as you have available in your agenda for mentoring. They were like, well, I still have to have breakfast and lunch and dinner, so I could use those for mentoring. And then like having the 3 hours for class. And so what I say is that a lot of people build houses or like ceilings for houses or donate people to like cancer research. For me, like my hobby is helping entrepreneurs from the very early stages build their businesses. And I feel very glad that I did that, because with the pandemic, actually our chapter became more global. We ended up having founders from every single Spanish-speaking country, and not only from Spanish-speaking countries, founders that speak Spanish that might be located in other parts of the world. We actually have founders in London, founders in Singapore, founders in Germany, founders in Canada, in the US, who want to do business here in Latin America. And what it's really funny is like how different our chapters are. No? Like there's a lot of things that might sound absurd. The Silicon Valley chapter, like how, for example, Easy Taxi, which was a competitor for Uber, grew here because it didn't use any paid media or any social to grow. It was like a lot of like word of mouth and with like cards that drivers used to give in the actual real taxis to recruit people. But like it's a lot about showing like, okay, you have a Silicon Valley mindset. You have like the tools for being an entrepreneur. You have like the skills to make you an entrepreneur, the knowledge to become an entrepreneur. You also have a network, no? And back then when we started, bear in mind that there's not a single unicorn in the region. And so creating that network and then being able for people to know like unicorn became something important. And then from there, like basically now also being able to train in this mindset, the founders has certainly become a difference, and it has made a great difference in the founders and like believing these 3 core norms for me entrepreneurship. No, the first one is if you believe that you can do it, you will certainly can. But if you don't believe that you can do it, you certainly won't be able to do it. The second part about being able to prioritize, obviously, because always as an entrepreneur, time and money are going to be the most scarce resource that you have, and ideas is what you're going to float on. Like being able to focus on what actually matters, what moves the needle, and on those things that are very important, working very smartly and not only hardly. It's the second thing that it's for me very important on meeting the founders. And I think the third thing that it's also very important for that philosophy is the ability to learn very fast. Why? Because this world changes very fast, and learning fast and on your own becomes one of the most valuable skills that you can have as an individual, as a team, as a company.
It seems you're so passionate about helping entrepreneurs build these amazing businesses and these amazing products. And I think you even have that written on your LinkedIn profile. It's such an incredibly powerful and good thing to be focusing on and helping people do. And I feel like it reflects back an older perspective of wealth as being an opportunity to give to your community, right? To like take care of people around you. And I think you exemplify that in your choices. And on that, I was hoping you could talk to us a bit about how you became a general partner at Billion Neurons, and what impact do you see this venture capital fund having in the near future?
It was very important also when we were doing Founder Institute was this very early stage, not get funded until they got to a certain milestones of growth. Why? Because capital continues to be very scarce down here. An idea, for example, the Silicon Valley is like an amazing metric in terms of like how much of the GDP is being reinvested. Then as venture capital, I think it's close to 10%. But when you think of that number, for example, for a market like Brazil, that number is around 3%. When you think of a market like Colombia, it's about 2%. When you think of a market like Mexico, it's about 0.8%. So still the amount of projects that are able to get funding, the amount of funding that those projects are able to get is still not very significant. Also, like in terms of funds, obviously, like very few of the fund managers have experience in companies and have experience like on growing these companies all the way to exit. Somehow common in the industry. And it just started happening a few years back. Like when we sold, we were one of the very first ones that lived throughout that process. Having all this network, having all of this knowledge, like it's not very fair to not putting my money where my mouth was. And so that was part of the reason why the fund started. And it's a fund where we not only seek to invest the money, like that's part of the reason why it's called Billion Neurons. No, it's a billion neurons in terms of only giving you the money, but it's how that support network will help you able to have a softer route in entrepreneurship, because I think that we know for sure climbing that mountain is hard. But you can decide if you want to bring a Sherpa and carry your backpack and lead the way where the mountain is the least steep, or if you want to do it alone.
That's a great analogy too. Yeah, it's I don't know if that's a motto that Billion Neurons uses, but maybe they should. You are doing so much. I mean, I'm kind of in awe of how many things you've been able to take on and become part of, but I'm also really admiring your tenacity to take on that many things. Do you have like, some sort of guiding philosophy or something you come back to that helps you decide like which things you should take on and, which things you should leave? Yeah.
Like there was a lot of things that I discovered when I was doing coaching and when I was getting my certifications. And there's basically three things that really move me, Like thing number one that moves me is this creating a better world. And entrepreneurship is just one of the ways you can create a better world. But like there have been other opportunities to create a better world. For example, I was part of Startup 20, which is kind of the G20 equivalent for startups. And so those are things that are very impactful because at the end of the day, you end up creating the regulation and the metrics internationally accepted to be able to grow an entrepreneurship. So those are things that end up being super impactful to fulfill that mission. Obviously, the second piece is being able to make an improvement for women. And in terms of making an improvement for women, it's worldwide, we obviously still need those role models for women. No, like when we see all of these statistics of March being Women's Month, and March 8th being Women's Day, like there's still a lot of disparity. And even though there were some disparities that I didn't even know that existed because of the way in which I had grown with a mother working and with a mother who had been divorced in the 80s in a small town in Mexico. When I arrived to work, certain things started happening that were very weird, no? Like there's no toilets for women in a factory. So you have to go to the headquarters to actually go to the toilets. Or things like you cannot work in operations in the real operational area because we heard that the people in the production factory might rape you or might be disrespectful to you. And so things that you never even thought, then all of a sudden became an issue professionally. And so that's part of like this becoming a role model as part of the responsibility from that side. No? And obviously the third one is technology. Because I think technology can really democratize the way in which the markets develop. And that technology is important in all of the stages of life, no? From kids learning how to program to companies understanding the impact that technology can have in their industries. So, for example, this thing that we were discussing before about AI, no? A lot of people think of AI like Robocop or Terminator, like, oh, the robots are going to get mad and then they're going to kill us all. And yes, that might happen. Same thing when the internet was created, that we thought the internet was all worn and all bad things. We can see how internet has brought the world closer, how internet has helped us globalize more, how internet has opened up opportunities to work cross-border, how internet has given us the chance to learn and has democratized access to education. And so I think that technology can certainly change lives. And it's like saying that we should still be weaving our clothes, those old weavers that happened before the Industrial Revolution, or that we should still be moving in horses before cars existed, no? And that today we should be riding horses instead of having electrical cars that are self-driven cars. So that's the part where I think that also like making people aware of the potential of technology, how to use it, how to lose the fear of getting through to it. I think those are the three things that guide whether something is a go or a no-go.
It's very important to have the guiding vision for your life and know how you how make those go, no-go decisions, as you say. I think that's very fascinating that you've got it so clearly. And I think that's probably a big part of how you've managed to do so many amazing things in your life. It's absolutely incredible, and I really appreciate that. We mentioned earlier that the Founders Voyage comes from the MIT Bootcamp, which is based on an entrepreneurship framework called disciplined entrepreneurship. Do you have any particular books or frameworks or tools that you found to be particularly useful in entrepreneurship?
Certainly. I think there's 2 or 3 different resources that I'm always very keen on recommending. The first one is obviously the MOM test, because being able to really listen to your users and listen to your users without any single bias and being really open to the feedback, it's something that I really appreciate and value. I think that that's why I'm also in the feedback type of industry. The second thing that I find very important, it's a book called Founder's Mentality. It's not very popular out there, but I think it has like all of these 3 mindsets that are most important to having an entrepreneurial culture. And it speaks a lot about why you should focus on things that move the needle and that move the needle fast, and why you should focus on your customers front and center of whatever you're doing, and why you should also like give this sense of ownership to every single person that works for your company, and that has like this hunger or this blood in the eyes, like they call it in Brazil, for thriving in a company. And I think the third one is the book of Clear Thinking from James Clear. And that one from Clear Thinking, I think it's very important because as entrepreneurs, I think that there's one thing that we have created and a story that we have believed, that is that you have to work super hard, that you have to work the longest of hours, and that it's a sacrificed life being an entrepreneur. And it's like, everything is a sacrifice. Working for corporate is a sacrifice. Being married is a sacrifice. Not being married is a sacrifice. Like, it's more a matter of like there are things you have chosen to do, and what do you with those choices? How do you prioritize for that North Star of what's important to you?
Very well said. Yeah, and that North Star, that kind of guiding force behind everything. That makes a lot of sense. I actually want to share a question with you from a listener who just has some noise in the background. They were asking if you could please talk about how one would apply to Billion Neurons for expanding to Brazil.
Well, Brazil is actually such an interesting market and a weird market that we're actually not very keen on investing yet on Brazil. And part of the reason for it is I lived in Brazil for a couple of years, and I've seen that Brazil is a market that has a lot of specificities that are not necessarily very similar to the rest of Latin America. You can actually see that there's very few brands that have been able to get out of Brazil and be successful in Latam. Like, Nubank is actually the very first one that is trying to prove that there's a chance for Brazil to win outside of Brazil. Part of the reason for it is because Brazil was a closed market for very long. It has a local culture that is very local, given that it was a closed market. So even the transnational typical brands actually don't win in Brazil. There's always a local substitute for everything. And the population in Brazil is so large that it's also very hard to think of getting outside of Brazil as a company. A lot of the companies.
That's so interesting. I've never heard of that sort of situation before, but it totally makes sense. Thank you for taking us through that. I think that's a really good point. Now, we do have at the end of each of our sessions, and unfortunately we are coming to the end, but we do have a particular question we'd like to ask. I very much want you to sort of interpret it in the way that makes the most sense for you. But the question is basically, do you have any words of wisdom or quotes or references that you want to share with us that you think, we could get value from? It could be something that you thought up yourself, something someone else has shared with you, anything like that.
I think it's a combination of one, knowing that there's many passions that someone can have. There's one purpose that anybody can have. And knowing your purpose is one of the biggest gifts that you can give to yourself. And similar to athletes, athletes, I always make this analogy of probably the person who's going to run those 100 meters in the Olympics is going to run in the Olympics for 30 seconds, 20 seconds? And in business, we don't value as much preparation as athletes value preparation, because probably that person has trained for years to be able to compete for those 30 seconds. And we spend so much time pushing and doing, and so little time being, and so little time actually reflecting on what are those important things that I have to do today? What am I grateful for? What have I achieved that I'm actually excited about that have happened in the last 24 hours? Because we always wait to celebrate until the big milestone happens. And even when we're celebrating, we're still thinking of, the next mountain I'm going to climb. So yes, entrepreneurship, it's a lot about not being conformist and pushing forward all the time. Is we can be entrepreneurs and be happier as well. Mind your mind.
Well said. Well, thank you so much, Lorena. We really appreciate everything you've shared with us and taught us today. I feel so inspired and so thankful to have the opportunity. Well, thank you so much again, Lorena. Wishing you a wonderful rest of your weekend and a wonderful week ahead.
Thank you, and have a good weekend and have an early start of spring.
Yes, happy spring. All right.
Bye.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
You've just finished another episode of Founders Voyage, the podcast for entrepreneurs by entrepreneurs. The team at Founders Voyage wants to thank you from the bottom of our hearts. We hope you enjoyed your time with us, and if so, please share this with someone else who might enjoy this podcast. You can also support us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and by donating to our Patreon. Outro music today is Something for Nothing by Reverend Peyton's Big Damn Band.